Utility provider NIPSCO under fire. An historic social media settlement. And a Secretary of State voter guide proposal. From the television studios at WFYI Public Media, it's Indiana Week in Review for the week ending August 28th, 2026.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by Par Ritchie.
Power has been restored for a majority of residents more than 2 weeks after a severe storm front hit northwest Indiana. Barb Anguiano reports many residents are frustrated with the region's utility provider, NIPSCO.
Portage Mayor Austin Bonta says he's heard directly from residents about their concerns with NIPSCO. He says rates have been going up for years, and after the August 11th storm, he wonders if customers are getting their money's worth.
For the amount of time it's taking, I think that the question really needs to be asked, what is the status of NIPSCO's infrastructure, and what are they doing to upgrade it, maintain it, and make sure it can handle future storms?
NIPSCO currently faces a class action lawsuit alleging the utility failed to manage vegetation as well as conduct adequate inspections of utility poles and power lines. Indiana Governor Mike Braun has also tasked Indiana's utility watchdog to investigate NIPSCO.
So could NIPSCO have done more in the days after the storms? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat, Ann Delaney. Republican, Mike O'Brien. John Schwantist, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly, editor-in-chief at Indiana Capitol Chronicle. I'm Jill Sheridan, managing editor at WFYI. So, Ann, did NIPSCO fail in its response after the storms?
Well, the governor obviously thinks so, since he called it a failure and called for an investigation. And I think what you do is you look at Illinois' response and you look at Indiana's response, and you're going to make an assumption that they face the same kind of weather, and their response was so much better. I mean, you still have people up there 2 weeks out that don't have power. It's ridiculous. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what didn't they do before the storm? Obviously, you can have a storm that is so tremendous that even healthy trees go down. But if you have dead trees by power lines that aren't being properly maintained, which apparently is the case here, then the utility is to blame, or the Utility Regulatory Council, which doesn't put emphasis on those kinds of cleanups. And I think you also fundamentally have to ask yourself whether we're putting enough of the resources that should be put into Gary in Gary. Okay? I mean, I know it's declining population, but the more you withhold from that and the more of these kinds of tremendous, terrible storms do damage, the less likely it is to ever rebuild. So I think we have to look at all of those things, and I think an investigation is clearly warranted, both in what was done after the fact and what wasn't done before the fact to protect them.
And that's what the investigation has now been filed. We'll be looking at the vegetation management, the tree trimming, as well as, if NIPSCO has spent dollars correctly in recent years. Will this give us a lot of insight into what went wrong, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. But I think it's worth, whenever this was catastrophic. I was actually up there for it. I'll talk about that in a second. I was under a bridge.
Yeah, I remember when it hit, right?
But a number of things. Yeah, I mean, one, I'm from there, and complain about NIPSCO is a pastime. It's like a hobby. And that's been true for a long time. But I do think it's important to look on the back end of these events and say, okay, what would we get right, what would we get wrong? Not just utility, turn the lights back on, but were emergency responders, prepared and all those things. But this was also, you also have to recognize what an extraordinary event this was. I mean, this had all the makings of a Category 2 hurricane. I mean, that was how powerful it was. I mean, you can trim the tree by the line, but if it gets pulled out of the ground and is flying through the air, I don't know how you're gonna.
No question.
What you're gonna do?
But if it's dead.
Right. Well, and they had just gone through. So I was up there. It took us they lost 370,000 customers in 1 second. It was the biggest outage in history, that rapidly. And then the roads were impassable. I was in Hammond. I was trying to get to Munster. That's about 4 miles, and it took me 2 hours because all the lights were off. All the side roads were entirely impassable because the trees were down in all these neighborhoods. as this thing ripped through and took it. I mean, that's how nice what an extraordinary event it was. These poor people up there too. They had from 2 weeks earlier. They had a ton of trees go down, and so you had piles of now brown trees that had been laying there, and the city was working. All those towns up there were working to go clean these up in piles out of people's yards. They're moving 210 tons of trees a week up there for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So it was pretty wild. I mean, being there was it was pretty extraordinary. When you have 100-mile-an-hour wind, you have 120-mile-an-hour wind gusts. Definitely take a look at it and go, okay, what do we need to do going forward, certainly, to try to mitigate this type of, because we're going to have more and more of these. This never happened up there before, this bad.
Are you saying it's climate change?
It's going to happen again.
Are you a Republican?
Hey, all I know is this isn't the weather I grew up with. I'm driving through Broad Ripple from the same storm that came and crested the White River.
I am hearing a lot of that, that we can expect more and more of this. So preparedness will be a key. The region, I think people were just really flabbergasted that it took so long. And it wasn't just Gary. It was Portage. It was the whole area.
That's true. Although if you look at the response and the houses that even well into this week were still without power, I think a majority of those were, quite a distinct majority were in Gary. It was a terrible storm, and there's no way I suppose anybody can really prepare for a horrible storm. But to continue the storm concept, it was the perfect storm in terms of PR headaches afterward too, because you had what arguably could be, slow response, certainly slow as defined by the people who wanted their power back on. You have not only customers concerned, but members of the faith community, which is a very vocal element of the community leadership in that area. You had the National Baptist Conference, which not just the local churches, but more broadly said this is a problem. NIPSCO needs to do something about this. We talked about the class action lawsuit dealing with vegetation management, which we'll be hearing about that more and more and more, as we will with the governor's call for an investigation by the Utility Regulatory Commission.
Let's not forget, people hate vegetation management.
It's
not like people are trim my tree.
Well, the reason I say perfect storm,
get out of my
beyond
yard.
all that, is it's not as if this utility, or many utilities for that matter, are sitting on a reservoir of goodwill. We'll cut them some slack on this one because we love our public utilities. We've already, how many times on this show in the past year we talked about people are pissed off at their...
But the
I didn't mean to shock you there. Sorry. Are very unnerved.
I can see it in a commercial.
Very angry. Sorry for your flower-like ears. Very angry that the utility costs, what they see as unchecked utility costs, whether or not they're justified or not, I think those people who are on the paying the consumer end are saying somebody's getting rich and I'm help funding it. So you already had questionable atmosphere environment that was already conducive to a PR headache. You wave this, you fold this in, and it really is the perfect storm.
All these counties, Nikki, are now receiving the major disaster declaration that was approved. Will this help, bring more money to Lake, to Porter counties and the recovery effort?
Well, it definitely helps. I think they approved 21 counties at first. Initially, they asked for 54. More could be added. But, everyone has to get on there and fill out the application, which I'm told is not all that easy. So hopefully they're on that, take lots of photos. And I do think, they will get some help back from state, federal, and local, because there are some local governments, doing some programs to help too.
It's been wild to watch. Well, also this week, children will have new restrictions on their social media following a multi-state settlement with social media company behind Instagram and Facebook. Indiana officials tout the settlement as one of the largest consumer protection agreements in state history.
Indiana will receive up to $419 million as part of the settlement with Meta. Attorney General Todd Rokita says the settlement will give parents assistance in managing child social media use.
There's no other settlement like this in our history, and it could be the model for future settlements in this technology-driven era we find ourselves.
The settlement includes a 2-hour hard cap on daily limits for children under 18 on both Instagram and Facebook combined. Those caps also include pauses after 15, 60, and 90 minutes of use to reduce continuous scrolling.
So, Mike, will this settlement have a positive impact for Indiana youth and families?
Certainly. Can we keep the adults off while we're at it? That's no better. They're no better.
Right.
Obviously, there's so much. A developing mind. There's so much data around the harm that prolonged exposure to this can do to kids. So yeah, the structure of the deal is the structure of the settlement and how it's administered is interesting because Meta agreed to they pay this out over 10 years. They'll pay another $5 billion if the same states require the other platforms to do it. So TikTok, YouTube, because this only applies to Facebook and Instagram. And so it was interesting how they structured the deal to try to pull attorneys general back in to target those other companies. And Meta said, "We'll put another $5 billion in if you make them live by the same rules, because it's all the same. I mean, it's the same impact, right, on kids. So that part will be interesting. But yeah, I think this. Look, it's one. I'm not sure I could. The likelihood of my tech-savvy kids to figure out a workaround if they wanted to is probably going to be pretty easy for them. So we'll see. We'll see, though. If nothing else, it's an important cultural change for young people and everybody.
I think that's exactly what it is. I think that they have read, and I assume they poll all these companies, and they realize that people, particularly the adults and supervising these children, are angry about this. And so they take this step, and it's a step. Okay, it's not a cure-all by any means. I mean, a lot of bad things can happen in 2 hours. You could be solicited, you could be bullied, all of those things could happen, but it is a recognition of the fact that there is starting to be pushback from adults concerned about this, and so they're reacting, and that's a positive thing. I do think, however, that we need to think where this money goes when it comes back to Indiana. And it ought to be targeted for kids. Right. I mean, if that's...
Kids' mental health? Kids' mental health would be...
Kids' mental health would be fine. Yeah. Having, preschool would be fine. There are, lots of ways we could assist children with $400 million worth of money. We need to think about that rather than a slush fund that goes into pay the gas taxes we haven't been getting or something.
That is one of my questions. I mean, I wanted to ask. I mean, $400 million, and a lot of the money that we used for the tobacco settlements did not necessarily go to tobacco prevention historically throughout most states. Will this help in the right places?
Yeah, I think the Attorney General will have to be creative on how they use it. And it doesn't all come at once. It's over 10 years. So, you're not going to be able to cover pre-K or, something like that. And usually these are these smaller settlements, right? And it goes into a settlement fund, which is partially then funds the office to continue to bring more of these cases of others. This is so large that I do think they need to have more of a plan for how to use it. And I think the mental health angle is a very obvious one that they could do.
And there are more parental controls, hopefully easier for parents to try to figure this out because, many parents have failed, and myself included, children in terms of almost guinea pigs, in this experimental
I'll speak for myself. I'm still trying to program the VCR. So,
You have a VCR?
Sorry.
Well, right next to my 8-track player. And I'm this close to getting my MySpace account. So you stay tuned.
Oh my.
But it's there are these controls. What I think is interesting here is that you have, it's not a competition in any traditional sense, but where will the policy changes, the most profound policy changes, come from? Will they come from the legislative process? And we saw some of that in the last session, where it was very emotional. You had a victim of tragic crime involving Indiana and Ohio, and parents coming forth and saying, please do something to help protect our kids. And there was, I think to the surprise of a lot of people, legislation that was enacted. And Indiana has been trying to be in the vanguard of those efforts. But then you have, this is one of literally thousands of lawsuits that the social media companies are facing. And at this point, it seems like the courts have brought about quicker, more profound change than the legislative process, which is not a surprise, I suppose. But now it'll be, I'm sure what it does set the stage for is, in the next session, adds perhaps spotlight, if not fuel, to lawmakers who want to go back, revisit the issue, and find out additional things that Indiana can do to appear to be proactive.
The easy thing would be to just apply the same terms to all the other social media platforms, but do it through legislation instead of waiting for the courts.
You could do that.
Yeah.
And maybe you could educate kids on what to look for and what to watch for in this in every class, you know?
It's important. Time now for viewer feedback. Every week we pose an unscientific online poll question. This week's question, will children be better protected as part of the social media settlement with Meta? Vote yes or no. The last question posed to viewers, has the state's response to the floods been adequate? 35% saying yes and 65% answering no. If you would like to take part in the poll, go to wfyi.org/IWIR and look for the poll. What if the Indiana Secretary of State's office released its own voter guide? That's the promise of independent Secretary of State candidate Greg Ballard. On Tuesday, he released a prototype of the voter guide he says his office would make available to all voters. Ben Thorpe has more.
The voter guide prototype shown to reporters includes information on how to vote, including individual voter rights and precinct-level races. Ballard says he believes the voter guide could help promote voter turnout and decrease wait times at the polls.
No Hoosier should ever walk into the voting booth feeling unprepared to cast their ballot. And no one should stay home because they didn't have time to learn who or what would be on that ballot.
According to Ballard's staff, the guide would cost roughly $2.5 million every year, something that could require support from the legislature.
So, Nikki, does this make sense as a campaign promise?
Look, I mean, at least he's trying to throw out some ideas, right? That's what I like to see in races. Everyone's going to have their own opinion on whether $2.5 million is a worthy, price tag for that. I did find some of the sort of vast, piling on against this idea to be funny, given the amount of money the current office holder has spent on various items, and I never saw the same piling on. So, it's one of his ideas, and, if he'll have to find a way to fund it if he gets elected.
We did hear during the debates this week as well, a lot of quick pushback saying, there's not money for that. But Nikki brings up a good point. I mean, unlikely spending in the Secretary of State's office has been happening for a few years now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's easy to jump on the price tag. There are other things about the philosophical aspects of this. Should somebody who's seeking an office be involved, presumably standing for re-election, be involved in that? I would also point out, first of all, I'm for anything that gets voters informed. If people can be informed about what they'll see on the ballot, how they can exercise their right to vote, what candidates, how they might connect with them, I'm all for it. The issue is there are already those resources to a large extent out there.
Yes.
Indiana Citizen is one example. League of Women Voters has been at it for a long period of time. Newspapers have been at it for a long time. Lots of voter guides that are very sophisticated and some of the things this would do, put in your address and you can see your ballot. Those are done.
Already done. Yeah.
The other problem, it seems to me, as soon as I say, and I may be Pollyanna by saying the more information, the more education, the better, but it's still leading the horse to the water and making them drink. If Hoosier voters, you could fill this table with all of the information they need. If they don't care enough about the process to actually devour it, or at least open it up and look at it or peruse it, well then, what do we have to gain? You're not planting a chip in their brain. So we still have a largely ignorant electorate, except for the people who watch and listen to the show. Everybody else I would classify as fairly ignorant.
We are, hearing a lot out of the Secretary of State race, and a lot, that was one of the complaints I heard, that, that a lot of the issues that are being discussed really have nothing to do with the office anyway. Is this maybe, and also Ballard has proposed, a bipartisan recount commission. Are these issues, better focused on what the office is actually at?
Yeah, it beats when Diego was railing on transgender sports.
Right.
In the last election, right? So, but look, I don't think we've done a bad job on process and things like that. Where I do think there has been a knowledge gap for voters, and this was going back to my time as chairman of Hendricks County, was understanding who is down ballot, who are these county sheriff candidates, who are the county council candidates, who are the my township trustee, and going and finding information on your U.S. Senate candidate or your state Senate candidate is easy. But this would incorporate that, so I think that's a positive. I think that's a positive development. And if it becomes like a the other guys have to oppose it. Their opponents promote it, so you got to go blast some holes in it. But I'm mostly with John that even if it's duplicative, it's all the better. And if you can learn more about candidates, you probably wouldn't have otherwise had any visibility on, then that's good too. The thing is 32 pages long. That's a lot I'm not reading that.
In Indiana, this is going to be the biggest race in November.
And he has to talk about something, so he might as well talk about this, and it's not going to get enacted because the Republicans don't want more voters. Nobody's going to come out and say, we want less educated voters.
I just said I was with John.
Oh, well, there you go. Which way does that cut? Anyway, on that, they don't want more voters, okay? They don't, so they're not going to spend the money. And I have a problem not with the amount of money. You're right, that's chicken feed in the overall scheme of things. The problem is I'm not comfortable having a partisan elected official who's going to be on the ballot determining what's essential information for a voter to know. It's much better done by these not-for-profits that are out there already doing the same thing. And by the way, no cost to the taxpayers.
I do have questions of whether it would actually, help drive more Hoosiers to the polls.
They don't want that. That's why they make it more difficult to vote. That's why we're 49th or 50th every year in turnout.
It is frustrating.
It's not.
The former head of Indiana's Utility Commission sued Governor Mike Braun over his firing from the board. And Braun's office announced the two had reached a $625,000 settlement. Eric Weddle has more.
Former Indiana Utility Regulator Commissioner Andy Zay alleged that Braun fired him because of a political disagreement. The 5-member IURC supervises rate changes, and Zay voted to approve a $71 million rate increase for AES Indiana customers. Braun denounced the hike, demoted Zay as commission chair, then he fired him. Zay sued, alleging Braun illegally removed him without cause. Braun countered that Zay misused campaign funds. The settlement means Zay will not try to regain his commission chair, but the state will pay him $625,000.
So, John, what should Hoosiers make of this latest utility commission drama?
Well, sort of, I think, what we saw unfolding before. There's a lot of pressure, and I'll go back to what we said 10 minutes ago. We have building animosity toward the utility sector, toward the governmental regulators that some Hoosiers think are not being aggressive enough. Clearly, the governor has bought into this, and in what some could say is performative, made this big splash about removing Andy Zay, an individual he had put in position just a few months earlier, and questions about whether, where does the performance start and stop, and where do the legalities and the realities of adhering to Indiana statute come into play. So to me, this tells me that the fact that Andy Zay, the person removed, is getting essentially his entire, if I'm not mistaken, the amount is what his salary and compensation would have been had he completed his term. That tells me somebody said, I guess he had a point. Yeah. If you think you're on solid ground and you're already have a chance you command the bully pulpit and you think you're doing the right thing, you're probably not going to settle that quickly. You're going to milk this policy cow and political cow a lot more until it's done mooing.
Nikki, I
got to get off that metaphor before the farmers can get
it. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about some interesting reporting you had done, about an assessment about whether it is valuable and whether there's risk involved now investing in Indiana's utility because of this political involvement.
Absolutely. Some of the investment advisors out there are starting to warn investors from Indiana's utility-owned companies because they're becoming very unclear about the profit margins they're going to be allowed to make. I wanted to note also about this, though. I think it was getting messy on both sides. Yes. No one was going to come out clean on that. There were probably going to be depositions. And the big thing is, if they had gotten some sort of temporary restraining order to stop moving forward on some of those cases, it would have ground the IURC to a halt. And I think that was probably pushing toward a settlement.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was the entire reason. I mean, if you had the governor's office through an intermediary trying to pressure someone in a decision making,
ugly on both sides.
Well, I know, but I mean then what they did is they said he can only be fired for cause. So they trumped up cause. His vote is not cause. And now they're admitting the fact that they completely screwed up by paying him his entire salary and his attorney's fees. Pretty clear. There may be some wrongdoing on one side. It clearly is weighted much more on the governor's side.
That is Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel has been Democrat Ann Delaney, Republican Mike O'Brien, John Schwantes, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly, editor-in-chief at Indiana Capitol Chronicle. You can find Indiana Week in Review's podcast and episodes at wfyi.org/IWIR or on the PBS app. I'm Jill Sheridan, managing editor at WFYI. Join us next time because a lot can happen in an Indiana week. The views expressed are solely those of the panelists.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by Par Ritchie.